Now let's take a closer look at what the recommendations are of the top industry body CII. CII President TV Narendran sat down for a detailed conversation with BTTV's managing editor Siddharth Zarabi.
With me today is a very special guest, TV Narendran, the Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of Tata Steel. He's also the President of the Confederation of Indian Industry. Welcome to the show, TV. Let me begin by asking you about the most pressing concern that seems to be weighing on the economy, on policy makers, on industry and the Aam Admi, which is the rapid spread of the Omicron variant. How do you think this is going to impact the economy? And before you answer that question, let me also share a data point. In response to a Business Today survey asking people's opinion on the feasibility and need of lockdowns to prevent the spread of the virus, an overwhelming majority of the responses said that there should be no lockdown because it will lead to significant economic pain. Where do you yourself stand on this matter?
Thanks, Siddharth, for having me on the show. Yes, the concern that you shared is a real concern. The spread of Omicron has been rapid, but I think, it's been milder than wave 2. So to that extent, people are not worrying as much as they did when wave 2 was spreading. There is certainly a concern on livelihoods. So if people feel that the risk to lives are less, they want to make sure that the livelihoods are not impacted. Because after 2 waves of COVID, a lot of livelihoods have been impacted, which is reflecting in a bit of fragility in the consumption. So I think it's not surprising that people don't want the lockdowns that they've seen, particularly in wave 1 and sometimes in wave 2. I also think industry is better prepared today to deal with it. Government is also more experienced, both at the central and the state level. And there's better coordination, or there can be better coordination between the central, state and the governments and the industry to make sure that the economic impact of COVID wave 3 is not as significant. As we saw in wave 2, also the economic impact was not as significant as wave 1. So if this is a concern, we also as citizens have to exercise restraint and avoid unnecessary risks to ourselves and to our families, and help the government to take care of COVID with the minimum lockdowns that are required.
We saw in the first wave and then the second wave the disproportionate impact on smaller businesses, the service sector. We are now seeing fresh restrictions which vary from state to state on small businesses, the health business, for example, in terms of the gyms and other restrictions, creeping curbs, weekend curfews. Is there a way to deal with this? Should the respective state governments who put in these curbs also at the same time announce some support measures for those sections of industry? Large companies like the one that you represent have the wherewithal. But for smaller businesses which barely survive and are on the low margin side, why shouldn't the state governments and the center provide them some support, immediate support?
Absolutely. I think your point is valid. If you look at the recovery post-COVID, many sectors have done well. Some sectors have struggled because they've been the most impacted by wave 1, wave 2 and now wave 3. Right? So our submission to the government has also been that the MSME sector needs to get the support that it's been getting. We need to continue with that support. High contact service sectors like the ones that you described, whether it's fitness, whether it is restaurants, hotels, tourism, aviation is just about coming back, etc. So some of these sectors need support, more than other sectors. And in fact, support can be directed to these sectors because some of the sectors don't need any support. So we agree with that. Whether what is it that can be done at the center and the state needs to be discussed with the local governments. But certainly as part of our budget proposals also, we've been saying that these are sectors which specifically need some support from the government.
One of the other features of the government response to the corona pandemic and the economic recession slowdown that occurred as a result was that while it opened up the fiscal tap, where it spent quite a bit more than was originally envisaged, some people say that direct income support for the underprivileged, for the weaker sections, and for the small and perhaps micro enterprises across the country is still lacking. Do you think the forthcoming budget should keep this in mind and appropriately respond to the evolving situation?
So we had, Siddharth, we had a few suggestions to the government. One is, of course, to continue with the support through Manrega, because that has been substantial and that has been important. So one is to continue with that as much as is required to make sure that the recovery is complete, particularly in the rural sector. The second part is to say, how is it that we can spend more on creating health infrastructure? Because if you really look at household incomes at the middle class and the lower middle class and the poorer people, you know, they've been hit by the fact that their health expenditure has been far more than they'd budgeted 2 years back or 3 years back. So there is a concern that household budgets are under stress, household balance sheets are under stress because incomes have been hit. If the family is working in some of the sectors that have been more impacted by COVID, jobs have been hit and expenses have gone up in some of these areas. So there is a concern. Those are the households that need support. At the lower levels, you have Manrega. At a more higher level, it's more about how can you secure them against such kind of unplanned for expenses in the future by great expenditure in health infrastructure, and also to create something like a pandemic pool, a pool of capital that is available to respond to any future pandemic, and that can be created over a period of time. And CII has also submitted a paper to the government on that. So I think these are all areas to be done. And the more we can do about creating jobs and stability of incomes, the better chances that we will have of consumption coming back with the momentum that it had in the past.
Why do you think the government has not been able to, for example, provide greater tax write-offs for the higher medical expenditure? I am talking of what is allowed on the personal income tax front, where there is a small amount of money that used to be deductible. Now, you yourself have mentioned that there is significant amount of medical expenditure that a lot of families have suffered. There are other issues that have come up. Do you think it's also time for the government of India, which provided a big corporate tax relief a few years back, to also do something on the personal income tax front for salaried individuals, for small business owners, for example?
You know, Siddharth, one needs to look at it in the overall context, because if you look at it from the government's perspective, they've spent far more on vaccination than they had planned to, right? By providing it across the country. So, and now with the booster shots, etc., there are a lot of expenses the government is directly incurring, which would have otherwise been incurred by the businesses, corporates, or individuals. Right? So the government needs to see how is the money best used in the most impactful way, so that it reaches all citizens.
The other side of the argument, allow me to interrupt you, the other side of the argument would be that the government has raised substantial revenues from elevated retail prices of petrol and diesel, for example, and that has been used for the vaccine point that you made. What I am trying to understand is, for a government which a few years back provided a huge tax giveaway to corporate India, is it not time to also provide some tax relief on the direct tax front to the individual taxpayers? You have GST rates, which is a completely separate budget outside the budget now.
No, I'm not arguing against that. All I'm saying is that, one needs to look at how much of money the government needs to spend on what. And if it is first ideally spent on vaccines, then it should spend it on vaccines before it gives the tax relief, because the tax relief is also relevant only to a certain section of society, whereas vaccines are relevant to all sections of society. And I think, to be fair to the government, till 3-4 months back, they were also not clear how much will be the revenues vis-a-vis the expenditure. I think the GST collections have been great. The recovery has been strong. Tax revenues have been strong. That probably gives the finance minister more headroom to maybe pursue some of the ideas that you're suggesting. But certainly the fiscal health looks much healthier than it was maybe 6 months back.
If the fiscal health is much better than what it was a few months back, what are the other key suggestions that you have made from a boost for growth, a booster shot for the economy?
Yeah. So the first and foremost is, of course, to continue to spend on infrastructure, because that is a force multiplier in many ways. It creates a lot of economic activity across the country because a lot of infrastructure is being built in rural areas. It creates jobs, it creates incomes for MSME sector, and it creates infrastructure which makes Indian industry more and more competitive. So I think that's an area which has multiple impacts, and we say our recommendation is please continue to spend even as much as private sector investment is slowly coming back, but let the government continue to spend on infrastructure that it has promised to and do it quickly and efficiently, which it's trying to do. The second part is on the consumption side, which we just discussed, is to look at how do we create more stable jobs, how do we improve the quality of jobs, how can we support labor-intensive sectors as much as capital-intensive sectors, how can we create incentives around job creation, how can we support sectors like textiles, leather, etc., which is more labor-intensive, and also electronics, which the government is anyway supporting and getting a fair amount of investment. The third part is how can we increase the spend on education, because a lot of children have been impacted by what has happened. So the investment or the expenditure on education is about 3% of GDP. How can we take it to at least 4% and higher? So because once you invest on education, skills, health, etc., hopefully you're dealing at a long-term fundamental level and creating more opportunities for people to go up the economic ladder. The other suggestion is also about improving the ease of doing business so that we can continue to get more and more private sector coming in. And the last point is to build a long-term roadmap on climate change, on technology and knowledge-intensive sectors, and also to encourage the startup ecosystem. So these, in a summary, are what we've been talking about. Some of it will have a short-term impact, and some of it will have a more long-term and medium-term impact.
One of the other points that we have been seeing in the past few months is as pricing power has come back to industry, it's been able to raise prices also on account of rising input costs across the board, as well as shortages and supply disruptions. Do you think the price increases across sectors has also played a role in impacting demand? The auto sector, for example, or steel, which you yourself know so much about.
So, you know, some of this increases have been because of the recovery being faster than people expected and consequent disruptions to supply chains. Right? So the supply side was not as ready. The logistics side was not as ready. So you had a shortage of containers, you had a shortage of inputs. Second thing which is happening, which is impacting everyone, is China is tightening up. China is reducing export. China has set its own net zero goals and certainly does not want to export goods which are carbon intensive, which are being produced in China. So they are saying we produce carbon intensive goods for China, but we don't want to produce carbon intensive goods for the world. And steel is one such commodity in that list. So that's having an impact on anyone who's been dependent on China as a source. So some of these changes are temporary, or pressures are temporary. Supply chains are already settling into the new normal. I think commodity prices have settled down to a more decent level than we saw maybe 2-3 months back. Container freight rates over the next few months will slow down, will come down. But there are some areas where it is still a few months away, like semiconductor supplies, there's improvement. But if you look at the passenger car industry, it's been impacted more by supply than by demand. I mean, there's enough of a demand for passenger cars, the supply which they've struggled with. Whereas some of the others, like motorcycles, have struggled more with the demand side. So I think it's a mix of both. Material in prices are one part of it and has impacted, but I think that will settle down to more normal levels over the next few months as supply chains settle down. But there are some structural changes that we need to be ready for.
Are you confident that private sector investment will pick up? We've seen the government do most of the heavy lifting in the recent past, and there are sectors where industry is now promising to invest, and hopefully the Omicron the evolving situation will not be a major hurdle. Do you think private sector investment is going to pick up in your position as the head of CII? What do other members tell you about that particular aspect?
So the general sense we got last month when we did a poll, we do a poll every time we have a national council, is that more and more CEOs are saying that the capacity utilization is improving at 70 to 80%, in some cases close to 100%. They're seeing demand growth both in India and in the international markets. Many are exporting well. Many have repaired their balance sheet, so they deleveraged. Profitability is improved for most companies, in many sectors. So as a consequence, the general intent was to increase investments, and that was the sense we got. I think a large number of our members said they have investment plans. If you look at sector specific, again, some of the sectors which have traditionally been the big private sector investors are metals. And I think metals, particularly steel investments, have already been announced. I think the steel industry is investing something like 15,000, 20,000 crores a year. They've already announced more than 500,000 crores of investments. Chemicals is another area where we're seeing investments come back. There are also investments happening in industrial supply chains, in warehousing, logistics networks, etc. So there are different areas, and of course, more recently in electronics manufacturing also, and the PLI schemes are also attracting investment. So we are certainly seeing private sector investment come back. It is still only 1/3. Like you said, 2/3 is government investments. The heavy lifting is being done by the government. But private sector investment is back to what it was pre-pandemic. Now we need to get back to where we were maybe 8-10 years back.
As we wind down this conversation, a couple of other points that I want to get from you. One, as the president of CII, what's your view on crypto regulation? The reason I'm asking you this is that it's a big phenomenon. There are a lot of people who have dipped into this. There are several operators. We've seen a bit of a back and forth. Would you be on the side of a ban or regulation? What is the stand that you would like the government and the RBI to take?
So I think as CII, the position we have taken, we've made is that we think it should be treated like securities with a different kind of oversight. So it should be seen as an investment class, like securities treated like a securities, and there should be some regulation. It's not an outright ban, but in a regulated environment, we can create room for cryptocurrencies, etc. And so that's our view, and we submitted a paper on that, and so that's where we come from.
Has there been a delay in framing crypto regulations, TV?
I think all countries are grappling with it because it's an emerging area. There are not too many precedents to go by. Some countries are banning it, some countries are over-regulating it, some countries are under-regulating it. So I think different countries are evolving their own strategies for it. Central banks are obviously involved. So I think we should allow the Indian government also to syndicate with all the stakeholders which they are doing, taking inputs from bodies like CII, and then come to whatever is the right long-term conclusion for the country.
Let me ask you another crucial point from your recommendations to the government recently, in which you have said that the government must adhere to the fiscal deficit target of 6.8% and reduce it to 4.5% by financial year 26. In the light of the evolving situation and perhaps business activity getting impaired to some extent, do you think you would stick to this advice, or would you want the government to be a little bit more fiscally, spending right now?
When we started, we thought 6.8 will be difficult to achieve, right? But I think the revenue collections have been quite robust. The recovery has been quite robust. And so the assumption is that with the kind of investments that the government is making in infrastructure and the kind of money it is keeping aside for it, the recovery can continue to be strong if the impact of wave 3 that we are experiencing now is not so significant. So I think if we continue with this pace of recovery, and the CII forecast for next year is 8.5% growth, then we should be on target for 4.5% fiscal deficit in the next few years. But if it is, for some reason, the economy doesn't recover as much as we expect it to, then of course we can look at what else needs to be done.
One of the other points that I've noticed from your recommendations is on disinvestment. The question I have for you here is that we have seen some plans for disinvestment not really fructified, despite the markets being on historic highs. There is also the additional plan for the national asset monetization. As a leading light of industry, do you think there is something more or different that the government needs to do to actually fulfill all the promises on disinvestment and national asset monetization?
So I think the intent is right. The execution is always challenging because of the political pressures and various other issues which come up to the government. So I think as CII, we welcomed Air India. There's Nilachal Ispat and a few others happening. There is LIC and a few others as well. So I think there is some momentum. Every year, there's a gap between delivery and promise on this, but I think the intent is there. There are some complexities that the government is dealing with. Directionally, they are clear that's where they want to go, but the execution is taking a bit more time than they thought. So we will be patient as long as they're moving in the right direction.
The farm sector law repeal, has industry taken that in stride really? That was something that was purely political and it does not impact the government's resolve in any way?
Well, CII was supportive of the reforms in the agriculture sector. For whatever reasons, it did not work. But I don't think we are seeing that as an indicator that on other reforms also they will be backtracking. I think overall the commitment is there. I think it's very important for the country to create conditions conducive for private sector investment, as we've just discussed. Government can't keep doing the heavy lifting. So you need to create conditions conducive to encourage private sector investment across sectors. And so from that point of view, all reforms are not only essential, but it's an imperative.
My final question, we've discussed the state of the economy. I also want to discuss the mood of industry. TV, how would you describe the mood of industry in the new year, 2022? Most of the pain hopefully behind us. What's your view on that?
Obviously, there is some concern of wave 3, which is rapidly, getting worse, but hopefully a milder version compared to wave 2. But there are some sectors who certainly need support. And I think while many in industry, including the sector that I represent, has done well, there are many who are struggling, services sector, as we discussed, and some of the MSMEs. So I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. Overall sentiment is positive, but there are pockets of industry which certainly need some support.
Absolutely. And that's what we would expect from the forthcoming budget. The budget is being presented in circumstances that have rapidly changed, and very clearly, the government of India will have to continue to do heavy lifting to provide the economy support and boost growth. TV Narendran, as always, thank you very much for your time on this pre-budget special on Business Today. With that, it's a wrap on this show. If you've been, thank you very much for watching.